In a cold prison room, under flickering fluorescent lights, a woman in an orange jumpsuit sat silently, her hands shaking, her eyes hollow, counting the final hours of her life. Tomorrow was her execution, but before she died, she asked for one final request, a request that shocked every officer who heard it. She didn't ask for food, she didn't ask for forgiveness, she didn't ask for her family, she asked to see her dog one last time, the only soul who had ever truly known her, her German shepherd, Raven. The guards thought it was madness. The warden thought it was cruel, because Raven wasn't just any dog. Raven was the witness whose violent behavior at the crime scene had sealed her conviction. The officers expected chaos. They braced for an attack, but when the dog entered the room, everything changed. Instead of aggression, Raven began whining desperately at his owner, a sound no one had ever heard him make. The officers froze in confusion. The warden's hand moved toward his radio. No one understood what was about to unfold. Moments later, a truth exploded, one that shook the entire prison and exposed a betrayal so deep it would destroy a hero and save an innocent woman from death. Stay with us, because this story will leave you speechless. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The prison woke before dawn, long before the sun even touched the razor-wired walls. A cold, heavy silence clung to the hallways, one that only appeared on execution days. Even the guards, men and women hardened by years of routine and violence, moved differently today. Their boots echoed against the concrete floor with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. At the far end of the death row corridor sat a woman whose story had once been front-page news across the nation. Her name was Helen Ward, former evidence analyst, former trusted federal employee, former daughter and sister. Now nothing more than an inmate in an orange suit, waiting for the final knock on her cell door. But Helen wasn't packing, she wasn't crying, she wasn't begging for mercy. She was sitting calmly on the edge of her bed, elbows on her knees, hands clasped tightly as if she was praying without moving her lips. Her dark hair hung loose around her face. Her eyes stared at nothing, or perhaps at everything she'd lost. The guards watching her from the other side of the bars exchanged uneasy glances. "Never seen one this calm," one muttered. "Yeah," the other whispered back, "makes it worse somehow." Helen heard every word, but she didn't react. Her mind was somewhere else, back to a time before the prison bars, before the handcuffs, before the trial that destroyed her life. A time when she still had a future. A time when a German shepherd named Raven was always by her side, her partner, her protector, her only family. A time before her own brother stood in a courtroom and told the jury that she was a murderer. A soft buzz filled the hallway as the main steel door unlocked. Every guard straightened. The warden stepped inside with a clipboard in hand, his face unreadable. Two prison psychologists followed behind him, along with a medical examiner, and standing in the shadows at the back, a man in a crisp military uniform with 39 years of service decorating his chest. Philip Ward, Helen's older brother, the decorated veteran, the hero of the family. The man who had testified that his own sister was a cold-blooded killer. The warden stopped in front of Helen's cell. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the silence. "Ms. Ward," he said formally, "it's time to review your final requests." Helen looked up slowly. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "I want to see Raven." The hallway went silent. One of the guards let out a sharp breath. The psychologist's pen stopped mid-note. The warden's jaw tightened. "Ms. Ward, I don't think." "That's my request," Helen interrupted, her voice still calm but now carrying an edge of steel. "I want to see my dog one last time." From the shadows, Philip shifted his weight. His face remained composed, but something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been fear. The warden glanced at his clipboard, then back at Helen. "Ms. Ward, You're aware that the dog's behavior at the crime scene was a significant factor in your conviction, the aggression he displayed toward you. He wasn't aggressive, Helen said quietly. He was trying to save me. That's not what the evidence showed. Then let him show you again. The silence stretched. The warden looked back at Philip, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. But Helen's eyes never left the warden's face. It's my final request, she repeated, unless the state has decided to deny even that. The warden's mouth pressed into a thin line. He looked down at the clipboard again, then let out a long breath. Fine, we'll bring the dog in tomorrow morning, before the execution. He paused. But if there's any sign of aggression, the visit ends immediately. Understood. Helen nodded once. As the officials turned to leave, Philip lingered for just a moment. He looked at his sister through the bars, his expression unreadable. Helen, he said quietly, don't do this. Let him remember you the way you were. Helen met her brother's eyes. The brother who had raised her, protected her, taught her everything she knew. The brother who had destroyed her. I want him to remember the truth, she said softly. Philip's jaw tightened. Then he turned and walked away, his boots echoing down the corridor until the steel door slammed shut behind him. Helen sat alone in her cell, hands still clasped, eyes still dry. And for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to hope. Because Raven had never lied to her, not once. And tomorrow, everyone would finally know why. Helen's earliest memory wasn't of her parents. It was of Philip's hand pulling her back from the edge of a frozen pond when she was 4 years old. She'd been chasing a bird across the ice when it cracked beneath her boots. The cold water had reached her ankles before Philip, only 13 at the time, grabbed her coat and yanked her backwards so hard they both landed in the snow. Don't you ever walk on ice without me, he'd said, brushing snow from her hair with shaking hands. You hear me, Helen, never without me. She'd nodded, teeth chattering, and he'd carried her all the way home on his back. That was Philip, always watching, always protecting, always 3 steps ahead of danger. Their parents had died in a car accident 2 years later. Helen was 6, Philip was 15. The state wanted to split them up, foster care for Helen, group home for Philip until he aged out, but Philip had fought. He'd stood in front of a judge and promised he could take care of his little sister. He'd already enlisted in a youth military program. He had a plan. He had discipline. He had references from 3 commanding officers who swore he was the most responsible teenager they'd ever met. The judge had given him 6 months to prove it. Philip had proved it in 3. By the time Helen turned 7, Philip was 18 and officially her legal guardian. He worked 2 jobs while finishing high school early. He cooked her breakfast every morning. He helped her with homework every night. He taught her how to tie her shoes, ride a bike, throw a punch if anyone ever tried to hurt her. And when she turned 12, he brought home Raven. Every girl needs protection, Philip had said, kneeling beside the 6-month-old German Shepherd puppy. I can't always be here, but he will be. Raven had been Philip's first K-9 assignment in the service. A tactical detection dog trained for explosive ordnance and security detail. But Philip had requested special permission to bring him home between deployments, and somehow, because Philip always found a way, permission had been granted. Helen had fallen in love instantly. Over the next 15 years, Philip's career became legendary. 39 years of flawless service, commendations from 4 different administrations, deployments in 7 countries, 0 disciplinary actions, 0 failed missions, 0 mistakes. He was the man they called when operations had to be perfect, the man who never cracked under pressure, the man who could infiltrate, extract, and disappear without leaving a trace. The hero. And Helen, she'd followed in his footsteps as best she could. Federal evidence analyst, security clearance, access to sensitive case files. She'd wanted to make him proud, wanted to prove that the little girl he'd pulled off the ice had grown into someone strong. She'd thought they were a team. She'd thought he would always protect her. But 3 years ago, everything shattered. The federal official, the botched transport, the crime scene drenched in blood. Helen waking up on the floor with no memory of how she got there, Raven barking frantically, her jacket soaked in something that burned her skin. And Philip, standing in the doorway in full tactical gear, weapon drawn, face perfectly calm. "I'm sorry, Helen," he'd said quietly, "but you were always going to be the weak link." Then the tactical team had stormed in. Philip had told them Helen had pulled the trigger, that Raven had attacked her because even the dog knew what she'd done. The evidence had been flawless, the testimony unshakable. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours. "Guilty." And Philip had stood outside the courtroom afterward, medals gleaming on his chest, and told the cameras that justice had been served. Now, sitting in her cell on the last night of her life, Helen closed her eyes and saw that frozen pond again. Only this time, Philip wasn't pulling her back. He was the one who'd pushed her through the ice. Helen had replayed that night 1,000 times, but the memory always came back in fragments, like a shattered mirror reflecting pieces of a nightmare she couldn't fully see. It had started with a routine assignment, high-level evidence transport from a federal facility to a secure courthouse across state lines, standard protocol. Helen had done it dozens of times before, but this time the evidence was different. Classified documents linking a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. Philip had called her that afternoon. "You working the Castellano transport tonight?" His voice had been casual, almost too casual. "Yeah, why?" "Just checking in. You know how these high-profile cases get. Extra security." Always, she'd laughed. "Don't worry, big brother. I've got Raven with me. No one's getting through him." "Good, that's good." A pause. "Be careful, Helen." "I always am." That should have been her first warning. Philip never told her to be careful. He'd trained her too well for that. The transport vehicle had been waiting in the underground garage at 22:47 hours. 2 armed escorts, 1 driver, Helen in the back with the evidence lockbox and Raven sitting alert at her feet. Then nothing. The next thing she remembered was waking up on the cold concrete floor, her head pounding, her vision swimming. The garage was flooded with red emergency lights, alarms screaming, the smell of gunpowder and something else, something chemical and burning. Her jacket, it was soaked. The fabric stuck to her skin, and wherever it touched, it burned. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't respond. Her hands were wet, red blood. Not hers. The federal official, the one they were supposed to protect, lay 10 feet away, eyes open and vacant, a single bullet wound in his forehead, execution style. And Raven was barking, not a normal bark, a frantic, desperate sound she'd never heard from him before. He was lunging at her, teeth snapping at her jacket, trying to grab the fabric, trying to pull it off her body. "Raven, stop." But he wouldn't stop. He kept barking, kept pulling, his eyes wild with something that looked like panic. Then the garage door had exploded open. Tactical team, full combat gear, weapons raised, flashlights cutting through the smoke and chaos. And leading them, Philip. He'd moved like a shadow, silent and precise, weapon trained on the scene. His eyes had swept over the body, over Helen on the ground, over Raven still barking frantically. For just a second, less than a heartbeat, Helen had seen something flicker across her brother's face. Not shock, not horror. Relief. Then his expression had shifted into something else entirely. Grief, anger, betrayal. "Stand down," he'd shouted at Raven. "Stand down now." But Raven hadn't stood down. He'd positioned himself between Helen and Philip, hackles raised, growling low in his chest. Philip's jaw had tightened. The dog's protecting her. He knows what she did. No, Helen had tried to speak, but her throat was raw, her voice barely a whisper. "Philip, I didn't." "Don't move, Helen." His voice had been cold, professional, the voice he used on missions. Put your hands where I can see them. She'd looked down and realized she was holding something. A gun. Warm, recently fired. She didn't remember picking it up, didn't remember firing it, didn't remember anything except waking up and the burning and Raven's desperate barking. I didn't do this, she'd whispered. Philip had stared at her for a long moment. Then he'd looked at the tactical team behind him and said the words that sealed her fate. Secure the suspect. The dog confirms it. She's guilty. Now, 3 years later, Helen pressed her hands against her temples, trying to force the memory into focus. But all she could see was Raven's eyes, wild, desperate, trying to tell her something. And Philip's face, calm, controlled. The face of a man who'd already won. The sound of claws clicking against concrete echoed through the death row corridor at 06:15 hours, 45 minutes before Helen's scheduled execution. Every guard in the wing tensed. They'd been briefed. They'd read the case file. They knew what the dog had done at the crime scene or what the reports claimed he'd done. Aggressive behavior toward the suspect. Defensive posture indicating threat recognition. Testimony from a decorated 39-year veteran that the animal had confirmed Helen Ward's guilt through trained tactical response. Now that same dog was being walked through maximum security toward a woman who was supposed to die before noon. This is insane, muttered Officer Chen, hand resting on his baton. We're bringing an attack dog to visit a death row inmate. Warden's orders, Officer Reeves replied, though his own hand had moved instinctively toward his pepper spray. Final request, we have to honor it. Final request should be a last meal, not a mauling. At the far end of the corridor, the steel door buzzed open. A K-9 handler from the county police department entered first, a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back tight, years of experience written in every careful movement. She held the leash with professional grip, but her expression was uneasy. Behind her walked Raven. The German Shepherd was 7 years old now, still powerful, but moving with the slight stiffness of a working dog past his prime. His black and tan coat was groomed immaculately. His dark eyes scanned the hallway with the trained alertness of a dog who'd spent years in tactical service. But the moment he crossed the threshold into the death row wing, everything about him changed. His ears shot forward, his entire body went rigid, a low whine escaped his throat, high-pitched, urgent, almost frantic. Easy, the handler said firmly, tightening her grip on the leash. Easy, Raven. But Raven wasn't listening. His nose lifted, scenting the air, body trembling with barely controlled energy. The whine grew louder, more desperate. Is he about to attack? Chen's hand closed around his baton. I don't know, the handler admitted, and that uncertainty sent a ripple of tension through every guard in the corridor. I've never seen him like this. The warden appeared from the observation room, clipboard still in hand, face grim. Behind him, inevitable as a shadow, stood Philip Ward in his crisp military uniform, arms crossed, watching with an expression of careful neutrality. Keep the dog under control, the warden ordered. Any sign of aggression, we end this immediately. The handler nodded, but her knuckles were white on the leash. They moved forward slowly, past the empty cells, past the guards positioned every 10 feet, toward the cell at the very end where Helen sat waiting. Raven's whining grew more frantic with every step. His claws scraped against the floor as he pulled forward, straining against the leash with a strength that made the handler brace her feet. Raven, heel, she commanded. The dog ignored her completely. And then they rounded the final corner, and Raven saw her. Helen Ward, sitting on the edge of her bunk in her orange jumpsuit, hands clasped, face pale but composed. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders. Her eyes, red-rimmed from 3 years of tears she'd learned to hide, locked onto the dog's face. Raven, she whispered. The German Shepherd exploded. Not in aggression, in desperation. He lunged forward so violently the handler nearly lost her grip. His whine turned into a sharp, urgent bark, not the sound of attack, but of alarm, of warning, of a working dog who'd found exactly what he'd been searching for. Guards rushed forward, hands on weapons. "Stand down," the warden shouted. But Raven wasn't standing down. He was barking at Helen with an intensity that made every person in that hallway freeze. Because this wasn't the bark of a dog who recognized guilt. This was the bark of a dog who'd finally found his mission. From the shadows behind the warden, Philip Ward's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his hand, hidden from view, clenched into a fist. The cell door opened with a metallic clang that echoed like a gunshot. Helen stood slowly, her legs unsteady after 3 years of anticipating this moment. She'd imagined it 1,000 times, what she'd say, how she'd touch Raven's fur one last time, whether she'd be able to hold back the tears. But she hadn't imagined this. Raven wasn't waiting for permission. The moment the handler loosened her grip even slightly, he surged forward, pulling the leash taut, his entire body straining toward Helen with a desperation that made the guards shift nervously. "Let him go," Helen said quietly. "Absolutely not," the warden replied. "The dog stays on leash, non-negotiable." "Then let me come to him." A pause. The warden glanced at Philip, who gave the slightest nod. "Fine," slowly, hands visible. Helen stepped forward, her movements careful and deliberate, hands raised slightly at her sides. The orange fabric of her jumpsuit hung loose on her frame. She'd lost weight in here, her body worn down by stress and sleepless nights. Raven's whining intensified. His tail wasn't wagging. His ears were pinned forward in that specific alert position Helen recognized from years of watching him work. He wasn't happy to see her. He was working. She knelt 3 feet away from him, and the moment her knees touched the cold concrete, Raven lunged the final distance. The handler barely held on as the dog pressed his nose against Helen's chest, then her shoulder, then her neck. His whine cut off abruptly, replaced by a low, rumbling growl that made every guard in the room tense. "Pull him back," Chen shouted. "Wait," Helen's voice cracked. "He's not." But Raven was growling now, deep and guttural, his nose pressed against the left side of Helen's neck, just below her jawline. Not biting, not snapping, just growling with an intensity that made the air vibrate. "He's going to attack." Reeves had his pepper spray out. "No, he's alerting," the handler said, and there was something in her voice, recognition, confusion. "That's a detection alert. He's found something." Helen's breath caught. Her hand moved instinctively to her neck, to the spot where Raven's nose pressed insistently, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt it. A ridge of scar tissue, hidden beneath her hairline, small, precise. "A burn." "What is that?" the warden demanded, stepping closer. From the back of the room, Philip's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "It's nothing. The dog's confused. He's old, probably doesn't even remember her properly." But there was something in his tone, something too quick, too defensive. Helen looked up, past Raven's alert posture, past the guards, directly at her brother. And she saw it. Fear. Not concern, not confusion. Pure, undiluted fear. Philip's hand had moved to his belt, a nervous gesture he'd trained himself out of decades ago. His jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle twitched beneath his eye. His breathing, always controlled, had quickened just enough to be noticeable. "Move the dog back," Philip ordered, and now his voice carried the sharp edge of command. "This was a mistake. End the visit." But Raven wasn't moving. He'd shifted his body now, positioning himself between Helen and the guards, his growl deepening as his eyes locked onto something across the room. "Not Helen. Philip." The handler's eyes widened. "He's not alerting on her, he's protecting her." "That's impossible," Philip said, but his voice had lost its steadiness. "From what?" the warden demanded. Raven's answer was to bark, once sharp and clear, directly at Philip's boots. The same tactical alert bark Helen had heard him use 100 times during training exercises. The bark that meant threat detected, target identified, mission active. Philip took an involuntary step backward. And that single step, that tiny, unconscious retreat from a dog he'd claimed was senile and confused, told Helen everything she needed to know. "He knows," she whispered, her hand still pressed against the scar on her neck. "Raven knows what you did." The room went silent. Philip's face drained of color. And for the first time in 39 years of perfect service, the hero's mask began to crack. Raven's teeth closed gently around the collar of Helen's orange jumpsuit. "Gun," someone shouted. "Don't shoot," the handler screamed, throwing herself between the guards and the dog. "He's not attacking, he's retrieving." It was true, Raven wasn't biting Helen. He was using the precise, controlled grip he'd been trained to use when extracting evidence from a scene, firm enough to secure, gentle enough not to damage. He pulled. The fabric stretched, sliding down Helen's shoulder, exposing the side of her neck fully to the fluorescent lights. And there it was. A mark approximately 2 inches long, raised and discolored, running along the curve where her neck met her shoulder. The scar tissue had a distinctive pattern, not the ragged edges of a cut or the circular impression of a bullet wound. This was a chemical burn, precise, deliberate, the kind of mark left by industrial-grade incendiary compound making contact with bare skin. The warden stepped forward, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion to something that looked like dawning horror. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," Helen whispered, her fingers trembling as she touched the scar. I forgot it was there." "You forgot a burn like that?" "The trial, everything happened so fast. They said I was in shock. They said my memory was compromised because of guilt." Her voice cracked. "I believed them." The warden turned to the medical examiner who'd been standing silently in the corner. "You examined her after the arrest. Why isn't this in the medical report?" The examiner stepped forward, pulling reading glasses from his pocket, squinting at Helen's neck. His face went pale. "I examined her for defensive wounds, signs of struggle, standard protocol for a suspect in custody." He paused. "Her hair was down. The booking photos show, yes, her hair covered this area completely. I never saw it." But a full medical examination was waived by her legal guardian for privacy reasons. The examiner's voice was barely audible now. The request came from. Every pair of eyes in the room turned to Philip. He stood perfectly still, his military bearing impeccable, but sweat had begun to bead along his hairline. "That's standard procedure for family," Philip said carefully. "Helen was traumatized. I was protecting her dignity." "Or hiding evidence," Helen whispered. Raven barked again, sharp, insistent, and this time he moved away from Helen entirely. He crossed the cell in 3 strides and sat directly in front of Philip's boots, nose pointed at the man's right hand. The same tactical alert position, target acquired. "Get him away from me," Philip said, and for the first time his voice betrayed him. It was too high, too tight. The handler frowned. "He's alerting on you. What's on your hands?" "Nothing, the dog's defective." "Raven has a 98% accuracy rate in chemical detection," the handler said slowly, her professional instincts overriding the confusion. "If he's alerting, there's a reason." The warden's expression had shifted completely now. His hand moved to his radio. "Officer Chen, get a forensic team down here. Now." He turned to Philip. "Sir, I'm going to need you to submit to a voluntary hand swab." "This is ridiculous. I'm a decorated 39-year veteran." "Yes, we know." The warden's voice had gone cold. "Which means you understand exactly how chain of evidence works. Voluntary swab, or I get a court order, your choice." Philip's jaw worked silently. His right hand, the one Raven had alerted on, closed into a fist. Helen stood slowly, the jumpsuit still pulled down around her shoulder, the burn mark visible for everyone to see. That night, she said quietly, my jacket was soaked with something. It burned everywhere it touched. I thought it was blood, but it wasn't, was it? Philip said nothing. Raven wasn't attacking me. He was trying to get the jacket off before the chemical ate through to my skin. Still silent. And you told them he was confirming my guilt. Philip's eyes met hers across the cell. For just a moment, she saw the brother who'd pulled her off the ice, the man who'd raised her. Then the mask slammed back into place. I want my lawyer, he said. And the hero's perfect record shattered like glass. The forensic team would take 20 minutes to arrive. 20 minutes that felt like a lifetime compressed into a single breath. Philip stood rigid, his military bearing still intact, but something fundamental had shifted in the room. The guards who had been watching Helen now watched him. The warden's hand remained on his radio. The handler kept her body between Raven and Philip, though the dog's attention never wavered. This is a waste of time, Philip said, his voice regaining some of its command. That dog has been retired for 3 years. His training is degraded. His alerts are unreliable. Then you have nothing to worry about, the warden replied. Philip's jaw tightened. He glanced at Helen, still kneeling on the floor, her hand pressed against the burn scar that had been hidden for 3 years. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Regret, calculation, Helen couldn't tell anymore. She'd spent her whole life reading her brother's expressions, trusting every word, every gesture. Now she wondered if she'd ever really known him at all. Helen, Philip said quietly, taking a single step toward her. You know I would never hurt you. Don't, the word came out harder than she intended. Don't do that. I raised you, I protected you. You framed me. I saved you, the words exploded out of him, sharp and raw. You have no idea what you were caught up in. The Castellano case, that evidence you were transporting, it would have destroyed everything. Decades of operations, hundreds of lives at risk. The room went silent. Even Raven stopped growling, though his eyes remained locked on Philip. Helen stared at her brother, the pieces finally clicking into place. You weren't covering up corruption, you were part of it. I was protecting national security. You killed a federal official. I eliminated a threat. Philip's voice was ice now. Castellano was going to expose classified operations, operations that keep this country safe. I did what was necessary. And you used me to cover it up. I gave you a purpose. Philip's control was fracturing, his voice rising. You were always weak, Helen, always needed protecting. At least this way, your life meant something. The cruelty of it hit Helen like a physical blow. Before anyone could react, Philip moved. His hand shot out, grabbing for Raven's leash, not to harm the dog, but to pull him away, to end this before it unraveled completely. His fingers closed around the leather strap. And Raven went feral. The growl that erupted from the German shepherd's chest was primal, nothing like the controlled tactical alerts from before. This was pure, protective rage. But he didn't lunge at Philip's throat or his arm. He lunged at Philip's hand, the one gripping the leash. Raven's nose slammed into Philip's palm, and the dog began barking with a violence that made everyone in the room step back. Not attack barking, alert barking. The kind of sustained, frantic alarm that working dogs reserved for one thing only. Explosives, chemical weapons, lethal compounds. Get him off, Philip jerked his hand back, but Raven followed, barking so frantically that foam appeared at the corners of his mouth. The handler's face went white. Oh my God. What? The warden demanded. That's a positive alert for incendiary chemical. Her voice shook. Active trace detection. Whatever he's alerting on, it's on that man's hands right now. Everyone looked at Philip's right hand, the one he'd tried to grab the leash with. The one he'd been unconsciously clenching and unclenching since the moment he entered the death row wing. The one he'd used 3 years ago to spread delayed reaction incendiary compound across Helen's jacket while she was unconscious. ensuring she'd be incapacitated and covered in evidence that looked like blood spatter. Philip stared at his own hand like it had betrayed him. "It's been 3 years," he whispered. "It should be gone." The warden's eyes narrowed. What should be gone? Philip's face drained of all color. He'd just confessed. And Raven, loyal, brilliant, unshakable Raven, had given them the proof. Officer Chen stepped forward, hand on his weapon. "Sir, I need you to put your hands behind your back." Philip didn't move. Helen rose slowly to her feet, the orange jumpsuit still hanging off her shoulder, the burn mark visible for everyone to see. "You taught me everything," she said softly. "How to be strong, how to survive, how to never give up." Philip's eyes met hers. "Thank you," Helen whispered. And she watched as they put her brother in handcuffs. The handcuffs clicked around Philip's wrists with a sound that seemed to echo through Helen's entire body. She watched the metal close around her brother's hands, the same hands that had pulled her from the frozen pond, that had packed her school lunches, that had taught her how to defend herself. The same hands that had doused her jacket in chemicals and put a gun in her palm while she lay unconscious on a garage floor. Raven was still barking, his alerts sharp and relentless, and the sound burrowed into Helen's skull like a drill. She pressed her hands against her temples, trying to quiet the noise, but it only grew louder. Louder. And suddenly, she wasn't in the cell anymore. She was back in the garage 3 years ago, the red emergency lights spinning, the alarms screaming, her body on the cold concrete, unable to move, unable to think. Raven barking. Just like now, the same frantic, desperate sound. Helen's vision blurred. The present and the past collided, overlapping like double-exposed film. "Helen," the warden's voice sounded distant. "Ms. Ward, are you all right?" But she couldn't answer. The memory was flooding back, sharp and terrible and undeniable. She'd been waking up when it happened, not fully conscious, but aware enough to sense movement, shadow, someone standing over her. "Philip." She tried to say his name, tried to ask what happened, but her throat wouldn't work. The chemical on her jacket had already started to burn through the fabric, the fumes making her head spin. Philip had knelt beside her, his face perfectly calm. He'd touched her shoulder, gentle, almost tender, and then his hand had moved to hers. He'd placed something in her palm, something warm, something metal. A gun. Her fingers had reflexively closed around it, muscle memory from years of training, and that's when she'd noticed his other hand. He was holding something else, something small and cylindrical, still attached to the barrel of a second weapon on his hip. A silencer. The same silencer that had been used to execute the federal official lying dead 10 feet away. Philip had looked at her, really looked at her, and for just a second she'd seen something crack in his expression. Pain, regret, the ghost of the brother who'd loved her. "I'm sorry," he'd whispered, "but this is bigger than both of us." Then he'd stood, removed the silencer from his own weapon with practiced efficiency, and pocketed it before the tactical team could see. By the time they'd stormed through the door, all they'd found was Helen on the ground with a smoking gun in her hand, and Raven trying desperately to strip the chemical-soaked jacket from her body. The perfect frame. Helen gasped, her knees buckling. Officer Reeves caught her before she hit the floor. "I remember," she choked out. "I remember everything." The warden crouched in front of her. "What do you remember?" The silencer. He had a silencer on his weapon. He took it off before the team arrived. "That's why the ballistics matched the gun in my hand. He switched them. He fired the shot with his weapon, then put his gun in my hand and took mine." Philip had gone perfectly still, his face a mask of stone. "She's in shock," he said flatly. "False memories, trauma-induced confabulation." "Is it?" The warden stood, turning to face Philip fully. "Because that would explain why the ballistics report showed gunpowder residue on her hand, but the angle of entry didn't match her position. The prosecution said she was standing, but you were standing, weren't you?" Philip said nothing, and a silencer would explain why no one in the adjacent building reported hearing a gunshot despite the garage door being partially open. The report said it was because of the cement walls dampening sound, but that never quite made sense. Still silence. Helen forced herself to her feet, her legs shaking but her voice steady. Check his service locker, his apartment, wherever he stores his tactical gear. If he kept the silencer as a trophy or if he was too careful to dispose of it improperly, it'll still have trace evidence. The warden's eyes narrowed. Officer Chen, radio the DA's office. I want a search warrant for Captain Ward's residence and service locker. Immediate execution. You're making a mistake, Philip said, but his voice had lost all its power. Helen stepped forward until she was inches from her brother. Raven moved with her, a silent shadow at her side. You taught me to never give up, she said quietly. You taught me to fight for the truth no matter what it cost. Philip's jaw tightened. Thank you for that, Helen whispered, because that's exactly what I'm going to do. And for the first time in 3 years, she saw her brother flinch. Everything happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Philip's eyes darted to the door, just a flicker. Barely perceptible, but Helen knew that look. She'd seen it 100 times growing up. It was the look he got right before he moved, right before he executed a plan that was 3 steps ahead of everyone else. The calculation. The warden was still talking, something about evidence preservation and constitutional rights, his hand reaching for his radio to coordinate with the DA's office. Officer Chen had turned slightly, responding to a question from the medical examiner about proper chain of custody for the hand swab they'd need to collect. The handler was focused on Raven, trying to calm the still agitated dog. 3 seconds of distraction, that's all Philip needed. He moved. Despite the handcuffs, despite being surrounded by armed guards, despite everything collapsing around him, 39 years of training took over. Philip drove his shoulder into Officer Reeves, using the man's own weight against him. Reeves went down hard, his pepper spray clattering across the concrete floor. Philip was already pivoting, hands cuffed behind his back, but his body a weapon itself, driving his boot into Chen's knee. Chen shouted in pain, stumbling backward. The hallway erupted into chaos. Stop him, the warden bellowed. But Philip was already at the cell door, moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd breached 1,000 hostile environments. Even handcuffed, he was dangerous. Even cornered, he was 3 moves ahead. He cleared the cell threshold, boots pounding against concrete as he sprinted toward the steel exit door at the end of the corridor. 30 feet, 20, 15. He was going to make it. Then Raven hit him like a freight train. The German Shepherd had torn free from the handler's grip the moment Philip moved, and now 70 pounds of muscle and fury launched through the air in a perfect tactical takedown. Raven's jaws closed around Philip's left calf, not to tear, but to anchor. The dog's weight and momentum brought Philip crashing face first onto the concrete with a sickening crack. Philip tried to roll, tried to kick free, but Raven shifted instantly, releasing the leg and going for the shoulder, his teeth finding purchase in the fabric of Philip's uniform and pinning him to the ground. A growl rumbled from deep in the dog's chest, low, sustained, absolutely final. This wasn't an alert, this wasn't detection work. This was a warrior protecting his handler from a lethal threat. Get him off me, Philip shouted, his voice cracking with something that sounded almost like fear. The dog's out of control. But Raven wasn't out of control. He was perfectly, precisely in control. His jaws maintained steady pressure, enough to hold, not enough to injure. His body weight distributed across Philip's back kept the man pinned without crushing him. His eyes never blinked, never wavered. Guards flooded around them, weapons drawn, but none of them moved to interfere with the dog. Because they could all see it now. This wasn't an attack. This was justice. Helen walked slowly out of her cell, her orange jumpsuit still hanging off one shoulder, the burn mark visible against her pale skin. She stopped a few feet from where Philip lay pinned beneath the dog he'd tried to use as a weapon against her. "Raven knew," she said quietly. "The whole time, he knew what you'd done." Philip's face was pressed against the cold floor, but his eyes found hers. For just a moment, she saw the brother she'd loved, the protector, the hero. Then she saw the monster he'd chosen to become. "At the crime scene," Helen continued, her voice steady now, "he wasn't attacking me. He was trying to save me from what you'd done. And when you told them he was confirming my guilt, you turned his loyalty into the weapon that condemned me." Philip said nothing, but he never stopped protecting me, not for 1 second. Helen knelt down, her hand finding Raven's head. The dog's ears twitched at her touch, but he didn't release his hold on Philip. "Good boy," she whispered. "You did so good." The warden's voice cut through the moment. "Captain Philip Ward, you are under arrest for murder, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent." The words washed over Helen like rain. She closed her eyes, her hand still on Raven's warm fur, and felt the weight of 3 years of terror and doubt and despair finally begin to lift. The hero had fallen, and the truth had teeth. The paperwork took 6 hours. 6 hours of statements and affidavits and emergency motions filed by a DA who looked like he might be sick. 6 hours of forensic teams descending on Philip's apartment and returning with a silencer wrapped in an evidence bag, the serial number filed off, but the barrel still carrying microscopic traces of the federal official's blood. 6 hours of Philip sitting in Helen's cell, staring at the walls she'd stared at for 3 years. But Helen wasn't watching the clock anymore. She sat in the warden's office, wrapped in a blanket someone had brought her, Raven's head resting on her knee. The dog hadn't left her side since the takedown, wouldn't leave her side, the handler had said quietly, even when they'd tried to take him for a routine check. Some bonds couldn't be broken, not by time, not by lies, not by betrayal. At 14:47 hours, a judge signed the emergency order of exoneration. At 15:03, the shackles that had been prepared for Helen's final walk were placed on Philip's wrists instead. At 15:30, Helen Ward walked out of her cell for the last time. The corridor was silent now. Every guard stood at attention, not because protocol demanded it, but because they didn't know what else to do. They'd prepared to execute this woman. They'd read her file. They'd believed the hero's testimony. Now they watched her walk past in clothes that weren't prison orange, jeans, and a sweater the warden had requisitioned from the staff lost and found, with a German shepherd at her side and her head held high. As she passed Philip's cell, she stopped. He sat on the edge of the bunk where she'd sat that morning, his decorated uniform replaced by standard issue orange. His hands were cuffed, his face was hollow. He looked up as she approached the bars. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, brother and sister, protector and betrayer, hero and victim. "I would have died for you," Helen said quietly. "I almost did." Philip's throat worked, but no sound came out. "I hope it was worth it." She turned away before he could respond, if he even had a response. She didn't need his words anymore, didn't need his approval or his protection or his lies. She had Raven, she had the truth, she had her life back. That was enough. The steel door at the end of the corridor buzzed open. Natural light poured through, real sunlight, not the artificial glow of fluorescent bulbs. Helen had forgotten how warm it felt. Raven pressed against her leg, getting her forward like he'd done 1,000 times before. The warden stood by the final checkpoint, holding a manila envelope. "Your personal effects, your documentation, and a formal apology from the state that doesn't even begin to cover what was done to you." Helen took the envelope with trembling hands. "Thank you. There will be compensation, investigations, accountability." "I know." And if you need anything, anything at all, I need to go home." The warden nodded. He stepped aside and the last door opened. Helen stepped through. The prison yard stretched before her, 30 yards of concrete and chain-link fence between her and the main gate, between her and freedom. She walked slowly, Raven matching her pace exactly, his shoulder brushing her leg with every step. Behind them, through the reinforced windows of the death row wing, Philip Ward pressed his face against the glass and watched the sister he'd destroyed walk away into the light he'd never see again. Ahead, the main gate stood open. A small crowd had gathered outside, media vans, cameras, reporters shouting questions Helen couldn't hear through the ringing in her ears. But she wasn't looking at them. She was looking at the sky, impossibly blue, vast and endless and free. Helen and Raven crossed the threshold together. The gate closed behind them with a final, resonant clang. And for the first time in 3 years, Helen Ward took a breath that didn't taste like death. Raven looked up at her, his dark eyes intelligent and calm and absolutely certain. "Let's go home," she whispered. The dog's tail wagged once. And together, they walked into the rest of their lives, two survivors who'd refused to let lies become truth, who'd trusted the bond between them even when the whole world said it was broken. The hero was behind bars. The innocent was free. And the dog, who'd never stopped protecting her, finally got to bring his handler home. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe. And tell me, do you believe animals know the truth when humans can't see it? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the most loyal witness is the one who never says a word.